JJK's writing is metaphorical, its themes implicit, relying on audience inferences to give the full context of the story, which is fine, to an extent, but unlike Hunter x Hunter, which actually has the passion of someone who wants to be writing stories, it ends up writing the line of subtextual writing and writing that just damn near feels empty. Part of this is due to Jujutsu Kaisen's subjective nature. Some call it postmodernism, where it takes on the writing style that is inherently anti-tradition. Some call it a biased narrative where ideals clash and whoever's stronger ends up taking the moral high ground. Some even call it lazy writing. I'm not a writing expert. I never wanted to come across like I know better than people who frankly read more than I do, so I'm sure there are stories that tackle this way of storytelling very well. Heck, there is a beauty in open-endedness when there's a limit. However, when the message of your story is essentially just saying, it's up to you, I walk away feeling like much of it was pointless. As in, a story devoid of a message, a call to action, and instead encouraging audiences to just think how they already do and allow life to take it from there, is something I don't think I need to read when I can just come to that conclusion myself with a long shower or something. I just feel like this manga found a cheat code. If everything is subjective to the characters, to the audience, if any interpretation or moral compass is equally valid, then every element that wouldn't make sense to you logically can easily just be justified by saying, well, it's up to you what you want to take as the message of the story. Like, Yuta conforming to the enemy's method of strength isn't a blatant contradiction of the story disproving Sukuna's philosophy, cause why would Sukuna's idea of strength be wrong? Yuji still believing he's a cog after all this time is fine, because what it means to be a cog is interpretable, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. This flawed society of Jujutsu sorcery that devalues individuality isn't wrong, it's just a different answer to the problems the characters face. So it's fine if every single cast member has no desire to push towards living for themselves. They're disposable, which is fine too, cause even that can have merit. It's all about what you as an individual choose to do with your life. It's all about subjectivity.
Fucking commie gobbledygook.
I don't use the phrase other woke nonsense often, but this is other woke nonsense. Let me blow the minds of my viewers real quick. There is a right and wrong. Half of the characters in Jujutsu Kaisen who want you to ponder whether or not their morality is justified want to murder millions of people, and probably have. And you can dress it up however you want, but a tool is a tool. A tool can't appreciate the memories it has, yearn for shared misery like things that are sentient can. It is literally an inanimate object. Therefore, when Yuji says, I'm still a cog, but I'm a cog that appreciates the fact it's a cog, that's utter woke nonsense. Because if Yuji did appreciate his life, the lives of humans, the spirit they have, and the memories that spirit can carry on, then he wouldn't be so willing to die all of the time. Because he would realize his life has more value than trying to unalive himself every arc for the sake of other people. And that goes for the rest of the cast. Like, what is the message here? We were put on this earth for one purpose, and our job is to fulfill that one purpose for the rest of our lives, even if it's something we don't want, because, well, at least we got to live while doing it. I thought the tragedy of JJK characters was that they had no idea they could live outside of their own purpose, that they didn't have to be pigeonholed by a dream held by somebody else. I thought the story was about preventing more gojos and ghettos, not telling them to lock in and suck it up. But if there's no right and wrong, then the suffering of the cast doesn't matter. They shouldn't be avenged. The system doesn't need to change to protect sorcerers, because the factions and people that created that suffering have ideologies that are just as valid as those held by the victims in that suffering. That's utter woke nonsense! The story may be about having different POVs, but there is still a preferred POV. One of togetherness. The new generation can erase the need for a gojo if they all work together. The superpower of teamwork, one would put it. How do I know this? Hi, Nobara. Yes, the woman with such a vague status that our only confirmation for half a decade was Yuji asking Megumi how she was, and him responding, "Oh," returns in Shujuku Showdown. Not only that, but Higuruma's alive, Takaba's alive, and even gets to have his own Kenjaku lookalike. Yuta's alive, Megumi even gets a girlfriend, every shitty Culling Games character gets a happy ending, as if they haven't wasted enough of our time. The only unhappy thing about the ending is, despite Yuji claiming the cycle of curses, the Jujutsu Kaisen will come to an end by defeating Sukuna. I can't believe that's the title drop. It's shown that Jujutsu Kaisen will indeed continue for the rest of time, since all of the characters will be stuck as sorcerer cogs for the rest of their lives. The story seems to favor the ideal of collectivism, even at the expense of Sukuna, who for so long was the moral center of the series. Now he isn't. Strength is no longer a viable perspective, but hope is. Sukuna is wrong in the end. Well then, what was the point of the story affirming he wasn't for so long? It gets confusing because the story will say that Sukuna's idea of strength is correct, reward those who follow it, punish those who don't, make it seem like his ideals are just as valid as anyone else's, and then turn around and paint him as someone who should be pitied, someone who ought to reevaluate himself in the next life. And then turn around again and say he was lying and say his obsession with genocide comes from the sad Godage backstory we never saw, meaning his ideals are to be empathized with, even though his attachment to violence was never coded as anything more than senseless fun. Is he a being who's above our understanding, or is he someone below us? Is his mentality one we can emotionally connect with, or is it just indiscriminate showboating? Why does he berate others for having empathetic ideals while having empathetic ideals himself? Why the hell would he even need to lie about not having ideals anyway? Is he embarrassed? You're telling us that Sukuna cares about what other people think? Why is Yuji, the person who was solidified in his role as someone who ought to kill curses, now empathizing with the curse? What is he, Deku? Like, I feel as though there are 4 different versions of Sukuna, and the story can't pick one. You might say this is because we're seeing Sukuna through different lenses, because of the subjective nature of the story. But that's you know what, never mind. Seeing how different people view Sukuna at first is totally fine, as long as the story either humanizes or rationalizes him at some point. But it never does. His actual personality, his motivations, his backstory is left in the air forever, never to be actually cemented because, like seemingly every other thing in JJK, the story prefers being vague, almost needing the interpretation of others, because it never wants to do the actual footwork of telling us what these characters mean, what the story wants to say, and what the point of any of this was. So what is it, Gege? Is it that hope prevails, that hope, love, and misery are needless emotions in the face of strength? Or is it that all emotions are meaningful, but you have to discard them to prioritize your role so that you can be an effective tool? Maybe he'll answer that in the sequel. My Hero Academia is allegorical to a fault, and once upon a time that was actually really admirable. Naruto may have paved the way for writing that was intrinsically empathetic, but My Hero Academia took that empathy to a whole new level. Simply put, MHA prided itself in having allegorical minorities in its story. You had characters that were stand-ins for disabled people, cultures and species that were discriminated against, literal embodiments of toxic masculinity, and while none of this was in your face per se, discrimination was definitely at the heart of the story. Feeling alone and outcasted because of things you can't control, or trauma and poor mental health gifted to you through a life of hardships. And while most of the story is about characters who can rise above it, there are just as many characters who unfortunately couldn't. And the thing with having such a deep understanding of how much it sucks to be marginalized is that when you don't treat the disenfranchised correctly in a story, it kind of makes you look like, well, when you kill all of the victims in your story just to progress the character arcs centered around overcoming weakness, or when you allow your disabled main character to get neglected by his friends, left alone by his comrades, broken by his own dreams, all the while having his thoughts almost incomprehensible due to a lack of introspection, it hurts. Because these characters aren't just a work of creative fiction, they're parallels to real people, real things people go through, and by giving the characters who deserve the world such awful endings, or by ignoring the independent needs of a singular character just so that you can make the individual obsolete in favor of a greater community, i.e. Class 1A or Hero Society as a whole, what you're telling us is that the needs of the marginalized don't matter in the grand scheme of an unjust, uncaring society, a downright prejudiced one that so many people in the cast wanted to rightfully destroy. And yet, looking at the fanbase that's attached to the series, there's no wonder that MHA's themes are the way they are. Like, the amount of times I feel spoken over just for criticizing the way the series handles discrimination, while also finding out later on that that person was either white or a Bakudeku shipper, or both, is honestly a little traumatizing. Not in the "my family doesn't love me so I'm gonna commit genocide" way, more so "my friend tried to help me stand up out of a lake and now I hate his guts" way, or whatever made Gege write the way he does. I'd imagine it was hitting his head. MHA is not just a show that borders the line between shonen influences and Western graphic novel plagiarism. Deep down, it's a story that seeks to critique society and prejudice that is systemic, individuality that is squeezed out of a group of people the moment they try to be themselves. MHA wanted to talk about how much it sucks to be part of a marginalized group, and how society as a whole should improve the conditions of those marginalized people if it intends on doing anything as glamorous as altruism. The thing is, it failed, like miserably. By trying to be the most progressive a mainstream shonen has ever been, it accidentally makes some pretty bad decisions with its characters who have already suffered at the hands of oppression, and probably shouldn't continue to suffer as they continue to suffer. And the problem is, trying to talk about that in a space full of people who don't know what discrimination is truly like, who have devoted their lives to not being aware of the cultures around them, but instead people who choose to obsess over the fiction and ships they like. It's like trying to explain to Disney why their live action films suck so bad. Like, what did you think was gonna happen? Trying to talk about why people who are subjugated because they look different shouldn't just smile and be nice in response, or how characters who are clear allegories for people who aren't able-bodied or cishet shouldn't constantly be the butt of the plot via dying or getting cut, or how I'm pretty sure all of the women in MHA only exist to fill up the jar next to Horikoshi's desk, is really difficult. But even if some of you did understand, it would be a lot easier to take the conversation around this series more seriously if the tone wasn't so volatile towards those of a more negative opinion. That is to say, talking about discrimination failures in fiction would be a lot easier to do if people who were only in it for the ships weren't so insistent on those failures not existing. What sucks is that, like, it was all for nothing. Because of MHA's deteriorating writing quality, no one really won because every character was reduced to a fraction of who they used to be, with none of the depth they possessed earlier in the story. I.e., every dynamic in the show is superficial because the story would rather focus on the idea of community as a whole rather than the relationships or even friendships those communities have birthed over the course of the narrative. Ochako has practically ignored Deku for almost a decade because I guess she was busy on certain business trips, and when Deku actually gains the drive to seemingly ask her out, I think, it's only made possible because a dead minority told Ochako that she wants her to be happy. Bakugo spent most of his life trying to be better for one specific person, trying to accommodate that one specific person, only to be rejected by that one specific person because, I don't know, I guess the quirkless bum somehow has better things to do, like taxes or jury duty. This is a real story, written by a person that I'm assuming graduated college. And remember guys, no matter how bad this ending is, you are completely incapable of doing any better. I digress though. Again, most people don't want to think about this stuff, because as long as they can imagine themselves getting swept away by Kanchan, the purpose of the story has been fulfilled. Their attachment to the series was superficial, just being tied to the imaginary chemistry between characters that they just made up in their heads. Which is fine, as a sort of escapism, but the moment that attachment transforms into tantrums, because people walked away from your favorite series, being unsatisfied for reasons you deem unfathomable, well, then we have a problem, don't we? Because those reasons aren't unfathomable. Who you are as a person just makes you incapable of understanding them. The Shibuya incident is a really fun arc, especially in the anime. The Halloween-esque tone, the fast-paced action, and intense character drama make for a really enjoyable experience. Not to mention, it's in the trio of JJK arcs that, I actually like. However, looking back, there's a lot about this arc that just did not age well. Shibuya is great because it's the payoff for plot points, but it was once great for setting up plot points as well. However, I can't help but feel like every, and I do mean every, plot point that was built up in this arc resolved rather poorly, and as such, I think TSI's legacy is a bit in question. This is more common than you think. The amount of poorly aged arcs in My Hero, for instance, is enough to make a grown man dizzy. That's because the biggest storylines of these stories tend to be setup arcs, an ushering in of a new status quo that the rest of the story is meant to capitalize on. But when you don't capitalize on it, then what was the point? Now, this is the part of the critique where I often lose people, so to mitigate that, I hope you don't mind if I rip off a friend of mine. Satoru Gojo is the strongest, that much is obvious, but what does it mean to be the strongest in a manga like JJK? Well, to be frank, you're lonelier than a high school teacher on Valentine's Day. When your loved ones are likely to die during everyday life, never to understand you or your strength, and when the one person who you confided in walked away when you needed him most because of a system you were unaware of, it tends to make you feel like you're trapped in a box. Gojo's strength is something that allows him to save others, people who, if it weren't for him, would turn out just like Geto. But it's a curse, a trap that doesn't allow him to relate to others. Except he can relate to others. Sure, not through shared tragedy or experiences, but he still has friends, a family who we'd never see, God I hate this manga, and students who want to give him the same love he gave them. Hell, when he's gone, those same students charge forward into the future, one that won't need someone like Gojo anymore. Gojo is the type of character who reacts to things inwardly. He hardly expresses himself because why would he? No one would understand. But I can't help but feel the best thing about the strongest trope is introspection. Gojo was absent during one of the most tragic events in all of Jujutsu sorcery. Why did the story, through a narrator, the commentary of other characters, or at least through visual storytelling, not communicate to us how he feels about what he's missed? His death rings hollow because the emotional buildup to it was entirely skipped over, emotional buildup that would have given us context to the fight. And after he dies, his body gets defiled, he gets no burial, his students move on seemingly without a care in the world, and one of the two guys who promised to never forget him dies before he can fulfill his promise to never forget him. Kenjaku is, for all intents and purposes, the diegetic author of JJK. Some of the stuff that's happened isn't even because of direct influence. He has such control over the story that he doesn't even need to directly push certain things to happen. They just happen. You combine that with a simple yet honestly hilarious motivation, and you have the setup for an amazing antagonist, especially since he's been around for centuries. Especially because he's the mother of our main character. And especially again because his puppeteering led to Sukuna's reincarnated twin birthing that same main character, and yet we get nothing. Everything involving Kenjaku almost ends up self-contained, birthing the US subplot to his dynamic with Yugi as it pertains to cursed energy. The story about human emotions does nothing with the concept of human emotions running amok, and then he dies, and we don't even get much of a post-death characterization. This isn't just about a merger or Heian era flashback, although those do hurt. This is about the story not allowing the character that represented half of its themes to properly flourish. His biggest impact, again, is allowing Sukuna's twin to reincarnate as Yuji's father, but even that has its issues. It just reinforces that Yuji has never and will never be anything more than a chess piece. A chess piece who says there's merit and value in his role, but in reality, it's just an object for the needs of a terrible jujutsu system. His experiences, his memories, his childhood, his humanity is what would have made him special if it wasn't for the fact that most of it were domino effects of his birth being manufactured. I mean, this kid went from regular high school students to crime-fighting Ghostbuster with no qualms. He's not shown to have any real teenage interests at the beginning of the story, and his desire for others to meet quote-unquote proper deaths, whatever that means, has been almost forgotten. So are we really surprised that Yuji isn't even a person at this point? He might as well be Frisk. When JJK wants to write a character, how does it do it? Well, you're introduced to the character, their personality, status, you start learning what makes them tick and what they need to work on to achieve some sort of homeostasis in their soul. And then, the story skips the process of them figuring these things out for themselves and places you at the end of their conclusion. They figured everything out, off screen. They've achieved freedom in a hyperbolic time chamber. Ironically, in the story that explores what it means to be human, these characters feel anything but. To my dismay, and to the dismay of many sane people, Bleach is one of the most influential pieces of manga ever. It gave a whole generation of mangakas the courage, see what I did there, to make a manga as cool, as collective, as dark, and as vapid as Bleach continues to be, even in the modern day. Bleach is about a lot of things. Life, death, our place in it, the way those concepts make sentient beings act in response to it, or in denial of it. But the problem is, it talks about these things in a very depressing way. Whether it is Ichigo achieving enlightenment despite that enlightenment making it seem as though his value is only derived from his powers alone, Rukia and Orihime becoming nothing more than the shadows of the men in their lives, the Gote 13 having their toxic ideologies validated as the consequences of their actions continue to wreak havoc on their self-proclaimed paradise. Every single action taken by Bleach characters feels, despite the narrative's seemingly hopeful message, very oblivious to the actual needs of the characters of the story. Their worth, their needs, and their esteem matters little in comparison to their duty, their role, their relevance to the plot, or the dirty mind of the author. I hope by now the parallels are clear. Every single one of Bleach's flaws, the over-subtlety, the reliance on cop-out subjectivity, the characters never learning of their own worth, the treatment from the narrative towards good-natured and/or lower-class characters being oddly bitter, are all qualities which reside in these two giants. These mangakas think it's alright to neglect character, as long as your art is good, your concepts intriguing and or deep, your battles cool, and while none can compare to the treacherous experience of reading a manga that feels like drastically different stories, each arc with different themes and power systems, except My Hero in my opinion, they all at a certain point come pretty damn close. I have to point out that I don't think these series are insincere per se. It's just Bleach and its two copycats almost celebrate self-deprecation. The idea that characters in a terrible, unforgiving world shouldn't allow themselves any merit, that they should just stick to the position they've been given as vestiges for other people's needs. I'm not saying everything has to be happy and cheerful by the end, but if you're going to show us the depravity of your setting and how that same setting births victims and people on the bottom of the societal totem pole, why would you then let the characters either ignore it, accept it, endorse it, or skip over the effects of it when you built your whole story around it, using the cast as nothing more than plot devices, rather than actual human beings who deserve more than they're given? I think My Hero is far worse than Jujutsu Kaisen. Of course, I'm biased. I loved MHA longer than I can even conceive a positive emotion in regards to JJK, but I also think MHA's politics are more harmful. I mean, nothing will beat telling oppressed people to just hold. But there's no denying that Jujutsu Kaisen is as anti-narrative as a story can get. Meaning, JJK might be self-aware with how little it cares for the finer details of storytelling. I mean, Gege Akutami's name literally means my manga is ass, but knowing that your story sucks doesn't change the fact that it does, especially when I walk away from it feeling like it's advocating for the suffering of human beings, just for the sake of a greater societal image. And in that way, My Hero Academia and Jujutsu Kaisen, despite seemingly swapping tones in its final arc, are more alike than you'd think. But that's not really the point of this video. Basically, before you jump the gun and mock the series that fell off, the series that someone you know loves while saying, couldn't it be blank? Trust me, give it a few years. We'll all be on the same sinking Titanic.